The furnace clicked off just past midnight, and in the sudden hush, Adeline heard her husband's voice coming up through the floor vent by the crib. She had gotten up to settle Poppy, who was teething and fussing, and she was standing there in the dark with her daughter warm against her shoulder when Grant's laugh floated into the nursery, low, easy. The laugh he used to give her, back when he still looked at her like she was worth looking at. There was another voice with his sister Whitney. And what the two of them were saying, spoken quiet and pleased with themselves at the kitchen table below, would take Adeline the better part of an hour to fully understand, and the rest of her life to forgive herself for not hearing sooner. She stood very still. Poppy's breathing evened out against her neck, and through the vent, thin and clear as anything, her husband's family laid out the whole thing they had planned for her, the way you'd lay out cutlery before a nice dinner. But to understand that night, you have to go back a little. Adeline had married Grant Holloway 3 winters earlier, in a small stone church outside Elmridge, Ontario. With the snow coming down so hard, the photographer kept apologizing. She was 29 then. She'd met him at the garden center where she used to work, back when she managed the whole seasonal floor and could tell you the light requirements of 200 perennials off the top of her head. He'd come in looking for something that wouldn't die on a north-facing balcony, and he'd come back 4 more times that month, and by spring they were together. He was charming in the way that made other people at a party gather toward him. She had liked at first, being the one he came home with. They'd had Poppy a year and a half into the marriage, and somewhere in the fog of new motherhood, the sleepless nights, the endless laundry, the way her whole body seemed to belong to someone else now, Adeline had quietly let go of the job, of her own paycheck, of the little life she'd built before him. Grant had encouraged it. It made sense on paper. Daycare in their town cost more than she'd bring home, he said. His sister could help. His mother lived close by. And besides, he said, wouldn't Poppy be better off with her mum? She still remembered nodding to all of it. She still remembered how reasonable it had sounded. The trouble was Whitney. Grant's older sister had moved into the finished basement of their house just for a few months while she sorted out her own situation, and the few months had stretched into more than a year. Whitney was the kind of woman who could make you feel like a guest in your own kitchen. She rearranged the cupboards. She commented on how Adeline loaded the dishwasher, on how much Poppy cried, on the state of the front hall. And Grant, when he was home, never once told his sister to ease off. He'd just give Adeline a look that said don't start and pour himself a drink. The money came through Grant. That was the part that snuck up on her. He handled the accounts. He'd always handled the accounts. Said he was better at it, and by the time Poppy was born, Adeline didn't have a card of her own that worked for anything but groceries at the No Frills, and even then Whitney would go through the receipts and ask, in that light voice, whether they really needed the brand-name diapers. Adeline started keeping the change from the grocery runs in an old tea tin at the back of the pantry. A few loonies here, a toonie there. She didn't have a plan for it. She just needed to know there was something in the house that was hers. Her own parents were 3 hours north, up past Halliburton, where her dad, Gordon, and her mum, Marion, ran a little marina and bait shop on the lake, the same lake Adeline had grown up swimming in. They'd worked their whole lives to put her through her diploma at the college in Peterborough. She couldn't bring herself to tell them how thin things had gotten. When Marion called, Adeline made her voice bright and said everything was wonderful, and then she'd hang up and sit in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes so no one would see her face. That was the shape of her life. The winter it all came apart. A house that wasn't in her name. A husband who was gone more than he was home. A sister-in-law in the basement counting her diapers. And a daughter she loved so fiercely it frightened her. The first crack came on a Tuesday in February when her friend Tamsin called and told her to get in the car. Tamsin was a nurse blunt as a hammer, the only person from Adeline's old life who'd stuck around after the wedding. Don't ask me questions, she said. Just come. And Addie, get here before you talk yourself out of it. So Adeline bundled Poppy to Grant's mother's for the afternoon, told a small lie about a doctor's appointment, and drove the 20 minutes into the city with her hands cold on the wheel. Tamsin was waiting outside a coffee place near the hospital where she worked, stamping her boots against the cold, breath fogging. Before you go in, Tamsin said, and she put both hands on Adeline's arms, I need you to breathe, okay? I'm sorry, I really am. But you need to see this with your own eyes, because if I just told you, you wouldn't believe me, and you'd spend the next 10 years letting him convince you it never happened. Through the front window of the cafe, at a table near the back, Grant sat with a woman Adeline had never seen. She was young, younger than Adeline, prettier in an obvious way, with long dark hair and a laugh. She kept touching his arm to punctuate. He had his hand at the small of her back. His wedding ring caught the light. He looked, Adeline would think later, more relaxed than she had seen him look in a year. He looked happy. That was the thing that gutted her, not the woman. The ease of him. She didn't go in. She didn't make a scene. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold with the cars hissing past on the wet road, and she watched her husband be a stranger, and then Tamsin steered her back to the car before her knees gave out. They drove down to the waterfront and parked facing the gray lake, and Adeline cried in a way she hadn't since she was a child. The kind of crying that comes up from somewhere below language. Tamsin didn't try to fix it. She just sat with her and passed her the wad of napkins from the glove box and waited. 2 years, Adeline finally said. Poppy isn't even 2. I know, maybe it's me, maybe after the baby I stop. Tamsin turned in her seat. Don't you dare finish that sentence. You did nothing. You hear me? Nothing. A man who does this was always going to do this. It has nothing to do with your body or your cooking or how tired you are. She squeezed Adeline's wrist. But I need you to be smart now, not sad. Because a man like Grant, when he gets caught, he doesn't get honest, he gets careful. That word stayed with her, careful. She would come to understand exactly how right Tamsin was. She didn't confront him that night. She thought she would. She rehearsed it in her head 100 times while she made supper, while Whitney complained that the chicken was dry, while Grant came in at 7 and kissed the top of Poppy's head, like a man with nothing on his conscience. But something Tamsin said had lodged in her. He gets careful, so Adeline got careful too. She waited 2 days, and in those 2 days, quietly, without letting her face show anything, she did 3 small things that she would later realize saved her life. She dug out her old laptop from the closet, and, in the 20 stolen minutes while Poppy napped, she opened a bank account of her own at a credit union. In the next town over, the kind of place Grant would never think to look. She put in the $80-some from the tea tin. It wasn't much. It was a door. She emailed a woman she used to work with at the garden center, who now ran a small landscape design outfit, and asked, casually just checking in, whether there was any freelance drafting work Adeline could do from home. Plant plans, planting schedules, the kind of thing she could do at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep. The woman wrote back within the hour. God, yes. When can you start? And she began that same week to write things down, dates, times, what Grant said and when, where he told her he'd be. She kept the notes in a document buried in a folder called Poppy Vaccine Records, because she had learned, in 3 years of marriage, exactly how her husband thought. When she did finally confront him, she did it on her terms. She waited until Poppy was down, until Whitney had gone out for the evening, and she called him into the bedroom and showed him the photograph Tamsin had taken through the cafe window. His face did something she'd never seen it do. It fell, and then it recalculated. She watched it happen in real time, the flicker where he decided which version of himself to be. Addie, he said, it's not what it looks like, then tell me what it looks like. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she used to find endearing. Her name was Brielle, he said. It had started as nothing. He'd been stressed, she'd been kind. One thing had led to another, and he hated himself for it. He'd been meaning to end it. He loved Adeline. He loved Poppy. He would do anything. And then he was on his knees on the bedroom carpet, gripping her hands, tears in his eyes, real ones, or good enough to pass, begging her not to leave, not to break up their family, not to do to Poppy what a divorce would do. A year earlier, that would have worked. Adeline knew it would have. She'd have folded him into her arms and taken on the guilt herself, and spent the next decade trying to earn back a love she'd never lost. But she'd stood on that sidewalk. She'd seen his face at the cafe, and Tamsin's word was in her ears. Careful, so she did something that surprised them both. She let him believe it had worked. Okay, she said softly, and she let her voice shake, because that part didn't take acting. Okay, if you end it. If you really end it. For Poppy, the relief on his face was so total, so instant that it turned her stomach. He hadn't been afraid of losing her. He'd been afraid of getting caught, and now he thought he was safe. She let him think it for 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, she drafted planting plans at midnight, and moved her small freelance payments into the credit union account, and wrote everything down. She was patient in a way she hadn't known she could be. She smiled at Whitney. She thanked Grant for doing the dishes on the nights. He suddenly, performatively, did the dishes. She played the grateful, forgiven wife, and she watched. It was during those 3 weeks that her father called with the news that changed everything. Addie, Gordon said, and she could hear the mix of excitement and disbelief in his voice. You're not going to believe this. That stretch of shoreline, the old lots your grandfather held onto. A resort company wants the whole parcel, for a development. Marion and I have been talking to a lawyer and sweetheart, it's a lot of money. More than we ever thought we'd see. Adeline pressed the phone to her ear and sat down at the kitchen table. That's wonderful, Dad, she said, and she meant it. And she also felt a cold finger of dread she couldn't yet name. We want to help you and Grant, Gordon went on. That's the whole point of it, isn't it? You leave something for your kids. We were thinking, once it closes, we'd put a good chunk toward you two. Toward a house of your own, in your own name, so you're not renting off. Well, her dad had never liked that they lived in a house that belonged, technically, to Grant's family. So you've got something solid. Bring Grant up when the papers are ready, and we'll sort it out properly. She almost told him then. The words were right there. Dad, Grant cheated on me. Dad, I'm getting out. Dad, don't tie your money to him. But Whitney's footsteps were coming up from the basement, and Adeline had learned that the walls in this house had ears, so she only said, Let me look at our schedule, Dad. I love you. Tell Mom I love her. She hung up, and she made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and she thought about how her father's 40 years of work was about to become the most dangerous thing in her life. Because here is the arithmetic she did at that table, cold and clear. The affair, on its own, Grant could survive. He'd apologize. He'd wait her out. He'd wear her down. But a wife with her own money, her own lawyer, and a father about to hand over a fortune, that was a different equation entirely. If Grant was as careful as Tamsin said, he wouldn't just want to keep the marriage. He'd want to keep it exactly long enough. She didn't know yet how right she was. She found out through the floor vent. It was a Thursday late, well past midnight. Poppy had woken up teething and miserable, and Adeline had scooped her out of the crib and stood there in the dark swaying her back to sleep. When the furnace shut off and the house went quiet, and she heard Grant's voice from the kitchen below, coming up crisp and unguarded through the vent by the nursery floor. He wasn't alone. Whitney was down there with him, and they were talking about her. Can't keep doing all of it, Grant, honestly, Whitney was saying. Cooking for her, cleaning up after her, playing the perfect husband you've lost weight. It's pathetic to watch. Just throw her out and be done. You don't get it. Her husband's voice low and amused. Everything I'm doing right now, I'm doing on purpose, so explain it to me. What's the plan? Because from where I sit, you're waiting on a woman who does nothing but drag around this house looking miserable. A pause. A cupboard opening, the clink of a glass. Her old man, Grant said, just came into money. Real money. That shoreline up north, a developer's buying the whole thing. We're talking 7 figures, easy, and they've only got Addie. There's no brother, no other kids. It's all going to her eventually. And the parents already want to hand a big piece of it over now. For a house, he laughed. For us. So I'm going to be the sweetest, most devoted husband you've ever seen, right up until that transfer clears. And then I'm done. Then she can go. Adeline stood frozen in the dark, her daughter's damp curls under her chin, and she felt something in her chest turn to ice, and then strangely, go very calm. And Brielle? Whitney asked. You're really going through with, she's what, 4 months now? It's a boy, Grant said, and there was a warmth in his voice then that he had never once used about Poppy. Did I tell you that? A boy. Once the money's clear and Addie's out, I'll bring Brielle and my son here where they belong. Mum's over the moon about it. A grandson. A beat. So do me a favor and stop riding Addie so hard for a few weeks. Don't spook her. Let her think everything's fine. You're smarter than you look, little brother, Whitney said, and they both laughed, and Adeline stood above them in the dark and did not make a sound. She did not cry. That was the thing she'd remember. She had done all her crying on a sidewalk in February. What she felt now was something older and steadier. She laid Poppy back in the crib, tucked the blanket, and stood watching her daughter's chest rise and fall in the glow of the little lamp shaped like a moon. And she made a decision, right there, that she would never again be a woman things were done to. She would be a woman who did. She did not confront him. She did not let a single thing change in her face. The next morning she made his eggs the way he liked them and kissed him goodbye at the door. And the moment his truck pulled out of the driveway, she called Tamsin, and then she called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Elias Vance, and Tamsin had found him, a family lawyer in the city, quiet, meticulous, well-regarded. Adeline drove in to meet him with Poppy on her hip and a folder of everything she'd been keeping. She expected a stranger. Instead, the man who stood up from behind the desk looked at her for a half-second too long, and then smiled in a way that was almost shy. Adeline Mercer, he said, using her maiden name without thinking. You won't remember me. She didn't, at first. And then slowly, she did. A lanky boy from the college in Peterborough, 2 rows over in a landscape history course, the one who always lent her his notes and turned red when she thanked him. He'd worn glasses then. He'd grown into his face. Elias, she said, and for the first time in a very long time, something in her softened. You went into law. You went into plants, he said, and glanced at the folder in her hands, and his face changed. Sit down. Tell me everything. And Adeline, he said it carefully, the way you'd say it to someone standing at the edge of something. Whatever you've been keeping in that folder, that was smart. That's going to matter. She told him everything. The affair, the photograph, the house that wasn't in her name, the account he controlled, and the plan she'd heard through the vent, the money, the mistress, the son, the timeline. Elias listened without interrupting and made notes, and when she got to the part about her father's shoreline sale, he set down his pen. Okay, he said, here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to let that transfer happen while you're still legally tied to him. If your parents put money toward a matrimonial home while you're married to Grant, it gets complicated fast. He'd have a claim on a chunk of it. He knows that. That's the whole point of his timeline, so we get ahead of it. He leaned forward. You keep your job. You keep building that account. You do not tip him off. And we quietly get everything in place so that when we move all at once, and he has nowhere to go. And my parents? Tell them the truth, Elias said. Today if you can. Not over the phone if you can help it. They need to know exactly what he is before they sign anything. She drove up north that weekend. She told Grant it was a visit, that her mom wanted to see Poppy, and he, playing the devoted husband, still weeks out from his payday, encouraged it, even carried the bag to the car. She watched him do it and thought about how good he was at this, and how she would never let herself be fooled by a kind gesture again. She told her parents at the kitchen table of the house she'd grown up in, with the lake gray and freezing outside the window and Poppy asleep in the next room. She told them all of it. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. Her father's face went from confusion to something dark and quiet that she had rarely seen. When she finished, the kitchen was silent except for the wind. You've been carrying this, Marian said, by yourself, all this time. Why didn't you? Because I didn't want to be a burden, Adeline said, and her voice broke for the first time in weeks. You worked so hard. I didn't want you to know I'd married a man who'd... Her father stood up. He was not a large man, her dad, but he filled the little kitchen when he stood. He came around the table and put his arms around her the way he had when she was small. You listen to me, Gordon said low. That money is not for him. It was never for him, and there is no version of my life where you are a burden to me. You come home. You come home as long as you need, and we will bury that man in paperwork so deep he never sees daylight. He pulled back and looked at her, his eyes wet. Your grandfather held on to that shoreline through 2 recessions so it could protect this family. It's going to do exactly that. It took 6 weeks to put it all in place, and they were the strangest 6 weeks of Adeline's life. She lived 2 lives at once. In one, she was the recovering wife, grateful and gentle, cooking Grant's suppers and thanking Whitney for small kindnesses, and letting her husband believe the transfer was coming any day now. In the other, at midnight, at the kitchen table with the laptop screen dimmed, she was building an escape, drafting planting plans that paid into her own account, forwarding documents to Elias, quietly moving Poppy's important papers into a bag she kept in the trunk of the car. Her parents, coached by Elias, stalled the developer's timeline with polite, unhurried questions. We just want our own lawyer to review it, you understand. Grant grew impatient. She could see it in him, the way he'd ask, too casually over supper, whether her folks had figured out the paperwork yet. She'd shrug and say these things took time, and watch him try to hide his frustration, and privately she found it almost funny. He had spent 3 years thinking she was too simple to see him. He had no idea she was reading him like a planting chart. The mistress, Brielle, forced the ending sooner than any of them planned. She showed up at the house on a Saturday afternoon, 6 months pregnant and out of patience, and rang the doorbell while Grant was out, and Whitney was in the basement, and Adeline was folding laundry with Poppy playing on the living room rug. Adeline opened the door. The 2 women looked at each other, and Brielle, who clearly had not been told that Adeline still had no idea her rival even had a name, said, Where's Grant? I'm done waiting for him to sort this out. I'm not spending the whole pregnancy hidden away like a secret. Here is where a different woman might have screamed. Adeline simply stepped back and said calmly, You'd better come in then. And she made tea, and she let Brielle talk. Because Brielle, it turned out, knew things Adeline didn't. She knew, for instance, that Grant had promised her the house, this house, once the situation was resolved. She knew about the money coming from Adeline's family, and thought it was funny. She had in her purse a whole history of texts between herself and Grant, months of them, that she was more than happy to wave around as proof of how much he loved her. Adeline, pouring tea with steady hands, asked to see one, just one, out of what she framed as heartbroken curiosity. and Brielle, delighted to twist the knife, handed her the phone. Adeline read it, and then, before handing it back, she did something Elias had told her to do if she ever got the chance. She read the sender's number aloud, slowly, as if committing her rival's face to memory, while her own phone sat recording on the counter beside the sugar bowl. By the time Grant's truck pulled into the driveway, Brielle had said enough, on and off the record, to hang him twice over. Adeline saw the truck and said, sweetly, "That's him now," and watched Brielle's face light up and thought, "You poor thing. You think you won." The confrontation that followed was loud and ugly, and Adeline stood back from it with Poppy on her hip and let it burn. Grant came in to find both women in his living room and turned the color of ash. He tried, desperately, to smooth it over, tried to tell Brielle to go home, tried to tell Adeline it wasn't what it looked like, the same tired words. Whitney came up from the basement and made it worse. And in the middle of it all, Adeline said very quietly into a lull, "The baby's a boy." "Isn't he, Grant? You told your sister it was a boy. Weeks ago." Through the vent in Poppy's room. The silence after that was the loudest thing in the house. Grant went still. "What did you say?" "I said I heard you," Adeline told him. "I've heard everything, for a long time now." She shifted Poppy on her hip. "You should probably call your lawyer, if you have one. I have mine." She did not stay to watch the rest. She had learned from Elias that the moment you have what you need, you leave. You don't wait around for the other person to escalate. She had the car packed. She had Poppy's bag in the trunk. She had, on her phone, a recording that made the whole scheme plain in Grant's own family's words. She walked out the front door with her daughter, and she did not look back at the house that had never been hers, and she drove to Tamsin's, where a bed was already made up. Grant did try, later, to make it physical. Not that night, but a week on, when the divorce papers landed, and the reality of what he'd lost caught up with him. He came to Tamsin's building and pounded on the door and shouted through it, and when Adeline didn't open, he waited by her car in the parking lot. But she'd been coached for that too. She didn't go out alone. Tamsin called the police, calmly, from inside, and by the time Grant grabbed Adeline's arm hard enough to bruise it, the one genuinely dangerous moment, in the stairwell, his face inches from hers, hissing, "You've ruined everything. You stupid." There were 2 officers coming up the stairs behind him. He was arrested for it. The bruise, photographed at the hospital where Tamsin worked, became one more line in Elias's growing file. There was no leap from a window. There was no knife. There was only the slow, grinding machinery of the law, which Adeline had spent 6 patient weeks feeding, and which now did its work. Her parents never signed the transfer to Grant. Instead, once the divorce was final, they put the money exactly where they'd always meant it to go. Into a home in Adeline's name alone, a small place near the lake, with a room for Poppy that got the morning light, and into a trust for their granddaughter that Grant could not touch if he lived 100 years. The developer's check cleared. The shoreline Adeline's grandfather had held on to through 2 recessions did precisely what he'd held it for. Grant did not walk away with nothing, but he walked away with far less than nothing he'd counted on. The recording, the texts, the assault charge, the documented pattern of financial control. None of it went his way. He kept his job, barely. He got supervised visitation with Poppy, which he exercised for a while, and then, once Brielle's son was born, exercised less and less. Because it turned out that a man who wanted a family for what it could get him did not much want one that couldn't. And Brielle, Adeline heard this later, from Tamsin, who heard it from someone at the hospital. Brielle had her boy, and within the year, when the money Grant had promised never materialized and the house was never his to give, she left him too. Adeline felt nothing much about that. She'd stopped needing other people's endings to feel whole. What she felt that first spring in the little house by the lake was quiet. She woke to the sound of Poppy babbling in the next room and the light off the water, and she made her coffee, and she opened her laptop to the design work that had become a real business now, with real clients, in her own name, paid into her own account. Her mother came by with muffins. Her father taught Poppy to skip stones off the dock, badly, joyfully. Tamsin drove up on weekends, and they sat on the porch with cheap wine and laughed about nothing. Adeline had thought, in the worst of it, that her life was over. It turned out it had only been waiting for her to leave the wreckage. Elias came up north that summer, ostensibly to bring some final paperwork that could easily have been mailed. He stayed for supper. He stayed the next weekend, too, and the one after, and somewhere in there the visits stopped being about paperwork. He was easy in a way Grant had never been. Easy the way a thing is when it doesn't cost you anything to be near it. He remembered how she took her coffee. He asked her opinion and then actually listened to the answer. He got down on the floor and let Poppy stack blocks on his back until he pretended to collapse. And Poppy shrieked with laughter, and Adeline stood in the kitchen doorway watching and had to look away for a second. He told her, eventually, on the dock at dusk with the loons calling out on the water, that he'd noticed her across a lecture hall 15 years earlier and never quite gotten over it. That he'd told himself she was married and happy, and none of his business, right up until the day Tamsin's name came across a referral, and there she was in his office, and he'd had to work very hard, that first meeting, to be professional. "You were," she said. "Professional." "I practiced in the car," he admitted, and she laughed, and it was the realest laugh she'd had in years. They took it slowly. She was in no hurry, and neither was he, and that itself felt like a kind of luxury after a marriage that had run entirely on someone else's timeline. But there came a morning, more than a year on, when Adeline stood at the end of a short aisle, strung with wildflowers on the lawn between her parents' house and the lake. No stone church this time, no snow, no photographer apologizing, just the people who'd actually shown up for her. And her father held her hand the way he had when she was small, and walked her toward a man who'd waited 15 years, and never once tried to take anything from her. Poppy walked ahead of them in a yellow dress, dropping flower petals in fistfuls, and then bending to pick some back up, and everyone laughed, and no one minded. At the end of it, Elias was waiting, and he wasn't shy anymore, and when Gordon placed Adeline's hand into his, Adeline thought about the woman who had stood frozen in a dark nursery, hearing her whole life get carved up through a heating vent, and she wanted to reach back through the years and tell her, "You get out, you do it yourself, and it's better than you can imagine on the other side." The lake was blue that day, not gray. She had noticed that. She noticed everything now. She had spent so many years keeping her head down and her voice quiet, saving loonies in a tea tin against a rainy day, that she had almost forgotten she was allowed to look up. She looked up, and the life in front of her was hers, the house, the daughter, the work, the man, the water, all of it in her own name at last. And no one ever again would get to plan it for her.